Well, thank you very much for that warm introduction. And I'm delighted to be here, even if it's virtually, to talk to you today about the world of Web3. So every once in a while, a technology bursts onto the scene that transforms the economic order of things and society in some profound and unexpected ways. The invention of the printing press democratized access to information for the literate, and a century after its invention, ushered in the Protestant Reformation, which changed the world. The invention of the steam engine ushered in the era of the railroad, and of course, the era of industrial capitalism and everything that followed. And today we are in a very unique situation because there's not one, but 6 or 7 new technologies that are all basically hitting maturity at exactly the same time. Everyone knows about artificial intelligence and machine learning. Chat GPT, I think, helped to write the introduction for me for this presentation, and I was actually pretty good at it too. We also know that AI has profound potential to do a lot of other important things. We're seeing the emergence of the Internet of Things and sensor technology, which is being embedded into every single industry, every supply chain, and every single device. New sources of energy, technology in our bodies, and of course, virtual reality. But there's one technology in particular that I believe is going to have a more profound impact than any other, and is actually going to help to really animate and enable this new digital age that we're on the brink of. And that, of course, is the technology known as blockchain. It's our view, in my view, after researching this for several years, the BRI, as Craig alluded to, is the largest independent blockchain think tank in the world. It's done millions of dollars of research looking at dozens of industries, over 150 projects in total. And the sum of all of that research basically is that we're on the brink of a new era of the internet. So let me explain what I mean by that. When you use the internet today to send and move information, you're not sending an original, unique thing. You're sending a copy, and you're retaining the original. Now, for most kinds of information, that's okay. In fact, it's one of the big benefits of the internet. If I send you an email with this deck as a PDF attachment, I can send the same version to someone else. If I host a website, anybody can access it. If I post something on Twitter, it's available for all to read. So in many respects, the internet is kind of like a printing press for information digitally. And that's a really powerful tool, just like the first printing press. It's democratized that information for those who have access to the web. Except when it comes to things that have value, things like money or stocks and bonds or titles and deeds or loyalty points or coupons or votes in an election or IP or other creative assets like art and collectibles, being able to create copies is actually a terrible idea. It's important that when I send money to someone that they know I can't send the same version to someone else. It's important if I sell a security that I can't sell the same share to someone else. Or if I trade art for something that I can't sell the same piece of art again and again. You see, if we have a printing press for value or assets the way we do for information, then the value and assets end up trending towards zero, right? And so this is actually a very specific computer science problem that very smart people have been trying to figure out for a long time. It's called the double spend problem. Basically, how do you ensure that when you move something of value online, that you don't retain a copy, that you can't send the same version to someone else? And it's a very difficult problem to solve. And as a result, even though the internet has ushered in all sorts of important changes in the world, a lot of transactions, a lot of business online looks a lot like what it did in the pre-digital world. In other words, we rely on middlemen and other intermediaries to sit in the center of transactions and perform some vital roles. Now, the traditional intermediaries are financial intermediaries like banks and brokers and stock exchanges and so forth. But increasingly, as the economy has become more digital, a new breed of middlemen has arrived. And these are the digital conglomerates and large social media giants that are not only the arbiters of value in transactions, but the arbiters of data, which is the most important asset class of the digital age. Now, these middlemen do perform some essential roles, and they do a decent job. The first thing they do is they establish identity of parties and transactions. They do all the business logic, the clearing, record keeping, settling, and so forth, and they establish trust between parties. But they have some big limitations. They're centralized, making them vulnerable to attack. They add cost and friction. They exclude big parts of the population. And as I alluded to earlier, they are capturing all of this data about the individuals that rely on them. And that's problematic for a few reasons. The first is that we can't use that data ourselves. We can't monetize it. We don't really own or control it. And it can end up in the wrong hands, undermining our privacy in the process. So what if the internet was entering a new era? From an internet of information to an internet of value. In 2008, an anonymous person or persons named Satoshi Nakamoto created this thing called Bitcoin. And what was really remarkable about Bitcoin was that it actually worked. And it's worked so well that it's set the stage for a new era of transformation. But what Bitcoin was trying to do was really kind of humble, but also important. It was trying to act as cash for the internet, basically a way to move value peer-to-peer without the need for an intermediary like a bank. You see, we have all this public infrastructure for moving information around the world, and that's known as the internet. The internet protocols are open protocols that we can use, public pipes to move information around the world. But before Bitcoin came along, there were no public pipes. There was no infrastructure for moving value. You had to rely on banks and other private institutions. And you needed permission from those companies and other entities in order to move value around the world. Bitcoin solved that problem. And it ushered in this new internet of value. It's also laid the groundwork for reinvention of the web. And that's something that's really exciting to me and is was mentioned in the introduction as the subject of my new book, which I'll get to in a second. The internet of information, the internet as we know it, actually began in 1969. It was a project that was spearheaded by the US Department of Defense in order to build a resilient, decentralized network that could survive a nuclear attack and keep the command centers running. And for the 70s and 80s, the decades that sort of followed its initial invention, it was a tool that was largely used by academics, people in government, technologists, and other individuals who are sort of hardcore into the space. But it wasn't until the 1990s and the invention of the World Wide Web by computer scientist Tim Berners-Lee, and then the web browser, Mosaic, Netscape, of course, and then Bing and Chrome and so forth, that the internet actually became commercialized. So the commercial internet, we can think of as the web, right? The World Wide Web. The first era of the web began in the 1990s with the invention of the web browser, and it's known as the read web. And the read web is basically a one-way medium, a broadcast medium to consume content. You could go online, you could access information, but you couldn't really interact with it. A lot of the early .com companies resembled things that kind of came before, right? Magazines, newspapers, classifieds. You could go to check sports scores, you could go to see what the weather was, but in general, it was fairly static. In the early 2000s, the web entered a new era known as the read-write web. And now the web was not just a medium for accessing information, it was a tool that we could use to communicate and collaborate. What made Web 2 is known as the read-write web in computer jargon basically just means that users could write to the web, which is to say that they could program websites. So if every time you upload a photo or you blog something or you tweet something or you contribute to some online community in some way, you're actually reprogramming the web in important ways. And this led to the era of social media and mass collaboration online. And there are some downsides to Web 2. Most of the value of this community content, this user-generated content, ended up getting captured asymmetrically by a handful of large companies that built curated walled gardens and used that data to sell to advertisers. And as a result, a lot of the early promise of Web 2 was unfulfilled. We're on the brink of a new era of the web, what's now known as Web 3, or the read-write-own web. So not only can you use the web to access information, i.e. read, not only can you use the web as a tool to publish information and to build communities and to collaborate online, i.e. write, but now you can actually own the digital asset class of this age, which is data. You can own your own identity. And critically, you can own your own financial assets and other digital goods. And you can decide how they're used, who they get sent to, and how they are monetized. And that's a profound shift in how we think about the web. A lot of the value that was created in Web 2 ended up accruing to a handful of large companies. In Web 3, the value that's created online is going to accrue to users themselves. This is the central thesis of the new book that I'm writing called Web 3, Charting the Internet's Next Economic and Cultural Frontier. Harper Collins is the publisher, and the book will be released on September 17th, 2023. The book is based on my own experience in the industry, obviously, as well as my wide reading of different material, but it's also based on over 50 interviews with many of the leading venture capitalists, entrepreneurs, technologists, builders, volunteers who are helping to steward the internet into this new and important era. So the read, write, own web, or the trust protocol, is something that I think is going to have an impact on many different aspects of business and on society. The principles of Web3 are fourfold. Number one is ownership. Until blockchain technology came along, there was no way to represent value in digital goods. Now there is. And as a result, ownership is going to be a feature of a lot of web applications and of the internet experience for many users. The second thing is governance. A lot of Web3 applications and new companies and projects that are emerging give users the ability to earn and own a share in that service and to vote on on how it is governed, to vote on the outcome of important matters, sort of like being a shareholder in a company, but much more dynamic. Number three is commerce. Most of the new applications that will emerge in Web3 are in areas such as that have emerged so far are in financial services and some other areas like in the art and collectible space. I think that is going to expand to many industries, but inherent to Web3 is the idea of transactions. So commerce is central to all of Web3. And the final piece is identity. What's unique about Web3 is that for the first time, we have a way to basically allow individuals to own their own data, to own their own identifiers, and to decide how that information is used. Until now, all that information was held on the servers of the large companies that we interfaced with. So today, I've got about 20 more minutes, and what I'm going to do with that time is take you through 6 big transformations of Web3. And I hope at the end of it, you get the impression that this is a big deal, and it's going to have an impact on your business, on your industry, and maybe even on your job. So the first thing is assets. Assets are foundational to Web3. Bitcoin is an important digital asset that didn't exist before 2009, but there are many other assets that are coming into existence as a result of this new technology. In many respects, Web3 is a sort of radical departure from the past, but in other respects, it's actually an evolution of a couple of macro trends that have begun hundreds of years ago, if not thousands of years ago. So the first is that assets are becoming more democratized. In the Middle Ages, a handful of wealthy landowners, the church and the king, owned almost all the land. In 1066, an accounting of the ownership of assets in England said that the king and the church together owned about 52% of all assets in the entire Kingdom of England. With the rise of industrial capitalism, value and assets became a bit more democratized. How did that happen? Well, most of the landowning elites of the agrarian age did not become capitalists. So a new breed of individuals emerged that launched companies using these new industrial tools, but also using these new legal tools, such as the joint stock corporation, to build value in the economy. And because these entities required large amounts of capital, a lot of times individuals had to participate in share subscriptions in order to fund a lot of these new initiatives. You're building a railroad, you need lots of different shareholders. The creation of all the wealth that emerged from that helped to democratize wealth a little bit further. Cornelius Vanderbilt was an obscenely wealthy individual. It's estimated that at his deathbed, if he were to liquidate all his assets, he would have taken 1 out of every $10 in the United States out of circulation. But even his wealth sort of paled in comparison to the wealth of the land barons of the medieval period. The 20th century led to a number of different important technological innovations and government interventions, which helped to democratize assets further. So the invention of the mutual fund, of the discount brokerage, of fractional share ownership, of zero fee trading accounts, of the ETF, all of these things lowered the barriers further and further and further for individuals to be able to participate in capital assets, stocks, bonds, and other securities. Until then, being able to even participate in the equity markets required you to be wealthy. You need to have a brokerage account. You needed to pay a broker massive transaction costs, and you needed to have information which wasn't easily available to you. So the march of technology helped democratize assets. And now we have this new digital economy with a new digital asset class. And we have new tools to help people earn and own assets in ways that were never possible before. So in many respects, the emergence of digital goods, of tokens, is very much an evolution of what's come before. And second, this follows another trend, which is that assets in the economy in general have become more abstracted. So what does that mean? Well, in a feudal sort of agrarian society, the most important asset in the world by far is land. Land produces food. Food is the thing that sustains everybody. So the more land you own, the more wealth that you have. Land is a very easy thing to understand. There was gold and money and other commodities and goods and so forth in medieval times. But historical accounts of the period say that most people never saw money in their whole life. They were living in a barter economy, and it was mostly produce and other agrarian goods that mattered, right? So if you own the land, you have all the value. The rise of the industrial age did create all sorts of new kinds of assets like railroads and steam engines, but the most important innovations were actually conceptual innovations, innovations like the joint stock corporation, like bonds, like paper money, these ways to abstract value away from things that you could hold in your hands to concepts, to legal constructs. And now today, this is the legacy we live with today. The wealthiest people in the world are not the ones who own the most farmland. They're the ones who own shares in public companies that create value in the economy. That is the legacy of the Industrial Revolution. And today, once again, we are in this another stage of abstraction away from stocks, bonds, and other sort of legal entities to digitally native assets or tokens. So what are tokens? Tokens are basically just containers for value. You can think of a website as a container for information. It's a blank slate. You can program it to do anything. It can be a storefront. It can be an encyclopedia. It can be, a video streaming service. It can be whatever. Tokens are similar in that respect. They're basically a tabula rasa to program anything of value. So the first token happened to be Bitcoin, but the ones that have followed have come to represent many different things: financial assets, deeds, contracts, creative assets, art, music, and so forth. And what's really interesting is that, well, I'll get to this subject in a second. Today we're trying to think of what are the things that tokens can do, but I think eventually we'll realize that, well, they're programmable assets, so they can kind of do anything. And not only can they act as inert stores of value of some kind, they can actually have intelligence. And that's where the concept of a smart contract comes into play. So a smart contract is a piece of code that basically mimics all of the business logic of a legal agreement, but does it peer-to-peer and in a self-executing way. So that contract can represent anything from a transaction, a financial asset, to something else, but it means that it's all executed in code and on chain, in other words, on a blockchain. And that means that many of the roles that the traditional intermediaries played in forcing the terms of agreements between parties, whether that's an exchange or a legal entity or a lawyer or an escrow agent, can be automated away using this technology. The four principles of tokens are that, number one, they're smart and programmable. They can be programmed with intelligence. They can represent assets of any kind. Number two is they're peer-to-peer. Tokens can be traded and transacted between individuals without the need for an intermediary. Number three is they're frictionless. Transactions and tokens occur in seconds or minutes, globally, instantly, and with very little friction or transaction costs, especially on emergent platforms that have found ways to scale transactions even further. And the fourth thing is they're self-custodial, meaning individuals can choose to custody their own assets if they want. It doesn't mean that they have to. There's a whole emerging industry of third-party custodians and other services that are helping companies and individuals who prefer to use that, but they have the ability to be custodied themselves. And that's a new concept. In the research that we've done, we've identified several different kinds of tokens. I won't go through all of them, but I will say that, this to do a token taxonomy today is kind of like doing a website taxonomy in 1993, when there were only a handful of websites. Of course, by 1995 or 97, people realized that, well, actually, there's millions of things you can do with a website. And the idea of categorizing it into a discrete set of subjects is sort of silly, but still, I think this conceptualization is useful. So the second transformation is to the individual or to the internet user. So the old way of doing things online was a form of digital feudalism. You are the internet user and you interact with all these different services. So you interact with e-commerce platforms, you interact with social media, you interact with search engines, you interact with streaming services, you interact with your government, and so on and so forth. And all of those different services know all of this information about you from all of your interactions online. And they use that information to target you with other services or to sell ads and ad space to companies. That is a form of digital feudalism. You provide all the data to them. This is the most valuable asset class of the digital economy. And in exchange, you get access to, some free services and other benefits. What we propose is that Web3 enables a new form of self-sovereign identity, where instead of all of these companies owning that information about you, you own that information and you decide how it's monetized, how it's accessed, who gets to see it, and so on and so forth. Web3 is a user-centric model when it comes to identity. This is the virtual me. There's a virtual you out there. And it turns out that the virtual you knows you better than you know you. You don't know where you went, what you said, what you purchased 1 year ago today necessarily, but the virtual you does. And that's problematic. We know that this information is very valuable. The market capitalization of the largest companies in the world is in the trillions of dollars, and it's dominated by technology companies who basically traffic in the most valuable asset class of this age, which is data. One fascinating topic in the world of digital assets that merges with identity is the idea of a soul-bound token. So a soul-bound token is basically a unique digital good that is assigned to an individual, perhaps at birth, kind of like a social insurance number. And it's a token that has intelligence. And as you go through life, it gathers information about you relevant to your health, your economic life, your social life, and so forth. And it's a token that is bound to your soul. It is something that is non-transferable, that you alone control, but that you can basically delegate access to depending on what you're trying to get after. So you move to another country and they want to access your health records. Well, you control them in your soul-bound token. You move to a different part of the world and you want to establish that you've got good credit. Well, there's an on-chain record of all of the things you've done financially that should give a bank comfort that you can pay back your loans. So that's the kind of potential we see around identity. The third transformation is to organizations themselves. So this individual is named Ronald Coase. He is a well-known economist who won a Nobel Prize for asking and answering a kind of deceptively simple question. The question was, why do companies exist? Why do we have firms? And his logic was basically, well, if the best way to, connect buyers and sellers and organize capability in an economy is using the open market, right? The invisible hand of the open market helps to sort of create the most efficient outcome, then why isn't everyone an independent contractor? Why does everyone work inside of this thing, this artifact, this, edifice called a company? And he said the reason was transaction costs. So long as it's cheaper to do things inside the boundaries of a firm than in an open market, companies will continue to grow, right? Because those costs are just much lower inside of the firm. And the costs he identified were things like the cost of search, the cost of coordinating individuals and coordinating assets, the cost of contracting lawyers, and the cost of establishing trust. So in the early days of industrial capitalism, the most successful business people just understood this, perhaps innately. So Henry Ford and the Ford Motor Company didn't just make cars. They had a rubber plantation, they had a timber mill, they had a steel plant. They were what's called a vertically integrated firm. The plant in Dearborn, Michigan that made Model Ts put raw materials in one end and cars popped out the other. With the invention of networking technology, the internet, telephony, and so forth, certain costs did begin to decline quite significantly. So all of a sudden you could call a contractor on the other side of the world and you could outsource and you could offshore and you could create new forms of enterprises known as business webs. And once again, we see that these new technology tools like blockchain and Web3 are very much an extension of what's come before. So now we have a new tool set that allows us to decentralize organizations even more. One, we have new tools to raise capital through token issuances. We have new ways to delegate ownership through tokens and governance tokens, a category of tokens. We've got new ways to organize and orchestrate capability through smart contracts. And there's a really just sort of simple example. I know those are some big words, but there's a very simple example of this. Let's say you created a new web-based application and you wanted to make it so that anybody who contributed to this this application as a user or maybe as a developer could earn a piece of the pie. At day zero, you're going to be global because you're an internet native application. So you might have people in 60 different countries. You're not going to go and contract and hire lawyers in every single one of those firms to figure out how to delegate or how to provide ownership or equity into that organization. The only logical way to do that is with a token that they can earn in an internet native organization known as a DAO. I see Craig's on, so I think that means I've got a few more minutes left. So let's just keep rolling here. Financial services is the subject, I think, of this event. We're here to talk about regenerative finance and new opportunities in fintech. For those of you who are watching this live, this is a device called a Rube Goldberg machine. It's basically this very complicated apparatus that performs a bunch of kind of complicated steps, and in the end, it solves a simple problem, like it cracks an egg or it closes a door. At the risk of alienating any bankers or financial services people on the line, this is basically the way the banking industry works today, where you think that that everything that's happening is digital and instant. You go to Starbucks and you tap your phone on the card reader, your Apple Pay, use Apple Pay to pay at Starbucks. You think there's some digital transaction, but actually what's happening is that transaction's touching several different intermediaries: your bank, the merchant's acquiring bank, payment processor, Apple, risk check, usually some kind of KYC. If you're in another country, there's Forex charge, and so on and so forth. So in the end, what ends up happening is that the merchant pays an interchange fee of 1 to 10%. If you buy a share of a company using Wealthsimple or Robinhood, you think a transaction's happening instantly. But of course, that transaction is settling T+2 or T+3 and is involving a handful of intermediaries. So a lot of the innovation that we've seen, so-called fintech innovation, is important stuff, but is in essence digital wallpaper, right? It is a veneer that helps to conceal the underlying workings. Whenever you interact with a fintech application, doesn't matter how advanced or how novel it might seem, it is still connected to the old world of banking. When you buy something in a discount brokerage, an application on your phone, you're still trading on a stock exchange. You're still, touching custodians and clearinghouses and so forth. So there's basically just like a new coat of paint on the old edifice. What's really interesting about Web3 is that Web3 is trying to reimagine finance from first principles, from what the industry does. And this category of Web3 is known as DeFi, or decentralized finance. So, the financial services industry is the most important industry in the economy. It's the lifeblood of global commerce. Many of the biggest corporations in the world are banks, certainly some of the most powerful. But fundamentally, the industry does 9 essential things in the economy. It establishes the identity of parties and transactions. It gives us a way to store value, to move value, to access credit, to exchange assets, to insure against risk, to organize financial information, to analyze different situations, and so on and so forth. And each of these different functions of the industry, there are dozens of examples of Web3 native applications that are trying to disrupt it. In the category of moving value, for example, US dollar denominated stablecoins today are in excess of $150 billion. And one of them, USDC, had cleared more in terms of transactional volume last year than the Fed's ACH wire system, for example. A couple more things before we wrap up. The number 5 is the human experience. So the metaverse is this much hyped topic that I think is been hard for people to understand, or at least define. But I think everyone can agree that the potential is pretty significant. Citibank estimates that over the next decade, the metaverse will create $10 trillion of economic value. So I think most people's version of the metaverse is basically a 3-dimensional web that you access using virtual reality, right? So Meta, the company, Facebook, has trying to launch its own metaverse. And you hear about Microsoft's metaverse project, and Google's got a metaverse thing. But fundamentally, if all you're doing is using virtual reality to access companies or services provided by those companies, you're just replicating the Web 2 model in 3D. So in order for the metaverse to work, and by that I mean a shared virtual space that anyone can access and where everyone's free to move around, the only way for that to work is with digital property rights, i.e. digital assets. You need to be able to own your own digital self and your own assets, and you need to be able to take them with you where you go. Right now, that's not the vision that most of these companies have. In Facebook's case, in fact, they want to charge a 50% fee for transactions that happen inside of their virtual world. So you can imagine, you've got a creator who built, who did a graphic design, some piece of art, and they sell it, as an NFT. Well, most NFT platforms are zero fee in the real Web3 world, but in the Facebook world, they'd be taking 50%. What happens when you resell it again, and resell it again? You resell that asset 4 times, it has no residual value, right? So this kind of model is it's not a virtual version of our real world. It's like a Disney World, right? It's this environment where you go, you play by the rules, they use their own currency, but in the end, it doesn't matter. It has no stakes. So if we want to create a virtual world that has the same stakes and the same richness as our real world, then we need to imbue it with the same rights. And namely, that means property rights. The final thing that I want to talk about is civilization as a whole. And that's a pretty highfalutin topic, but there's one area in particular that is top of mind for a lot of people, and that's the subject of money. One of the ironies, in my view, of Web3 is that the first, killer app for digital assets was Bitcoin. It was also the most ambitious and kind of the most insane in a way. The first attempt at creating value online was an attempt to recreate money, right? To disintermediate central banks. That is a pretty tall order and quite an ambitious project. And as I mentioned earlier, what's remarkable about Bitcoin is that it worked. Bitcoin today, notwithstanding all of the ups and downs and so on and so forth, is an asset that's worth $400–500 billion. It's used by people all over the world as a store of value, as a medium of exchange, as a financial lifeline, especially in parts of the world where people are underbanked or where the local currency is unreliable or where the government is corrupt. It's estimated that upwards of 300 or 400 million people interact with Bitcoin in some way. I just came back from South Africa. 3 of the 15 countries where Bitcoin is the most popular are in Africa: Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya. In Nigeria, crypto asset ownership is de rigueur. It's the thing that most young people engage with because it's the only way they can store and move value digitally. And yet, I'm not sure that Bitcoin is going to become money for the world in the way that we think about money. Will it become the dominant medium of exchange? Will it become the unit of account? Meaning, will things be denominated in Bitcoin? Will we be buying cars and, my Toyota Highlander will be 2 Bitcoin or something like that? I'm not so sure. But I do think that Bitcoin will continue to play an important role as a store of value. We have gold, it's a physical store of value for an industrial economy. While we have Bitcoin, it's a digital store of value for a digital economy. To me, that makes inherent sense. But there are other visions for what the future of money might look like. The second one are stablecoins, basically corporate currencies. As I mentioned, the value of US dollar denominated stablecoins is in excess of $150 billion. And I expect that's going to continue to grow. The impact of stablecoins on our world is not clear yet at this point. But one thing that interests me is how US dollar-based stablecoins might destabilize a lot of countries in the world where the local central bank is worried about dollarization. So well before Web3 and crypto and all this stuff, central bankers all around the world feared that their currency would get substituted with dollars. And as a result, they impose capital controls, they make transactions in certain currencies illegal and so forth. I was on a panel in the Middle East with the governor of the Bank of Pakistan. Him, and Nouriel Roubini, who's this grumpy economist some people might know. And basically, the governor of the Bank of Pakistan said, we're really worried about Bitcoin, because, and digital assets more generally. Number one, we don't want to end up on the wrong list. He had this conception that maybe terrorists use these assets, which is actually not substantiated. But his bigger concern was that people would just start substituting transactions with digital assets. And as a result, they would lose complete control over their currency. So this is something that we should be keeping an eye out for. And then the final vision for what money is going to look like is offered by the central banks themselves. Their view is, okay, this is an important technology, but left to the free market, it's probably not a positive thing for the world. Why don't you let us create our own digital dollar and we'll be the ones in control. We'll just use this new tool set. This is something that maybe has some benefits theoretically, like it could lead to greater financial inclusion. Everyone can have a bank account with the government, could make sending money to people in times of crisis like COVID a lot easier. But in my view, the risks far outweigh the benefits. The risks are that you are going to basically create a financial surveillance society where every single transaction in the economy is tracked and recorded by the government, which is something that I think we got to think very carefully about before pursuing any further. One final note on regulation. So for any industry to succeed, you need sensible regulation. And ideally, you actually need policies that are far-reaching and well thought out. You know, the internet succeeded because of a couple of things: the passage of the Telecommunications Act and Section 230, which basically allowed internet companies to not be held responsible for content uploaded by users, not be held responsible for copyright issues for content uploaded by users. Obviously, if the users were doing illegal things, they had a duty to report that. And that sort of ability for information to flow freely on the web led to a lot of economic value being created. So we need good policies, and we need good smart regulations for Web3 as well. But we also need to be careful not to impose rules and regulations without understanding the potential of this technology. In the 19th century, the government of London, England, introduced these things called red flag laws. And red flag laws basically required that any car needed two people to operate it. It needed a driver, and it needed a man walking in front of the car waving a red flag. And the reason for this is that they were worried that this weird new contraption was going to spook pedestrians, but more importantly, horses. And so the red flag guy was there to basically alert horses of the coming of a vehicle. So if you think about the benefits of a car, that you can move freely around the world, that you have autonomy, that you can maybe move quickly, having a guy walking in front of the car waving a flag kind of defeats the purpose. So we need to make sure any new rules and regulations we create do not defeat the purpose of the new technology that we're trying to develop. The final thing is on legacy attitudes. This is a new paradigm. When you get new paradigms, leaders of the old react with hostility or derision. They try to fight back. I'm a great admirer of Warren Buffett. I think he is a brilliant individual, but he's someone who has taken the position basically that digital assets are sort of inherently worthless in a way, which is odd to me. It sort of reminds me of the people who kind of emerged from the agrarian age and said, paper money and shares in public companies and other sort of forms of abstracted value were inherently worthless. And throughout history, we've seen plenty of other examples of where leaders of the old order have sort of struggled to embrace the new, whether it's the invention of the iPhone or radio, or rocket technology or transistors or PCs. Time and time again, these people have been proven wrong. And by the way, look at the individuals. There's some pretty brilliant individuals here who got it wrong, and it's okay to get it wrong, but we need to be mindful of this kind of thing. So I'll end with this final note, and I'm a few minutes over, but I think this is still important. So there's this old parable about the invention of chess, and it basically goes something like this. The king of the land, he is so pleased with this new invention that he offers the creator anything he wants in the kingdom as a reward. And the creator of chess, who you might imagine is a pretty crafty fellow, says, I'm just a humble servant of your majesty. All I need is some rice to feed my family. But I'd like for you to give it to me in the following way: 1 grain on the first piece of the chessboard, 2 grains on the second, 4 on the third, and so on and so forth. And the king, who, I'm sure he's a great leader, but he's obviously not, a math guy, says, yeah, sure, whatever, your, humble request from a humble servant, and says, your wish is granted. Of course, 4 becomes 8, becomes 16, becomes 32, becomes 64, and so on. So by halfway through the chessboard, it's more rice than the entire kingdom can produce in a year. And by the end of the chessboard, it's enough rice to cover the entire planet in 6 feet of rice. Now there's a sort of a corollary to the story where the king gets very pissed off at the guy and chops off his head. That is not the moral of this story. The moral of the story is about the exponential power of technology innovation. In the 20th century and into the 21st century, there was this thing called Moore's Law that we still kind of rely on it, but it's running sort of to the end of its course. That says that the number of transistors that you can fit on a single chip will double every 18 months, right? So basically computing power will double every 18 months. And that kind of exponential growth was not a law of the land. It was more like a promise that, or a challenge to technologists to try and invent. Now, what's fascinating to me is if you look back to the beginning of the first digital age, the 1950s and 60s, the invention of the chip, and you fast forward to today, the world is unrecognizable from what it was then, both technologically, but also economically, culturally, socially, and so forth. I think the first digital age kind of took us to the middle of this chessboard. And right now we're on the 32nd piece and we're looking towards the future. Just imagine how much the world is going to change, what this new cultural and economic frontier is going to look like. And as it emerges, what kind of opportunity and challenges there are going to be. So that's what I'll leave you with. I hope to come back again soon, closer to when the new book's out, to give you an update. But until then, thank you so much for having me. Craig, I'll pass it back to you.